Hello, everyone, and welcome to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you, as always, by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. We should have another fantastic show. As always, as we are entering the kind of final games of these playoffs, we are going to be looking at the NBA Finals and the Stanley Cup Finals, although since this is kind of a weird day in terms of Stanley Cup Finals, I'll be looking at the Conn Smythe betting odds for today's first segment of the show. Then we'll be going and recapping a very interesting Game 3, to say the least, between the Boston Celtics and Dallas Mavericks in the NBA Finals. At the midpoint of our show, we have a very intriguing segment after Darren Waller's retirement, how it changes the tight end fantasy landscape and who to kind of lean into for the upcoming season in terms of fantasy football, so it should be very intriguing. But then stick around to the end of the show where more Euros action takes place. I will be previewing not just one but two teams and two heavy favorites in this tournament, so you want to stick around for that. But before we get into all the fun stuff, I just want to remind you to please like, follow, and subscribe to the show. It is a huge support. We also get a lot of tips and donations, so if you do feel so inclined, leave them at the link GSMC.cloud. Sorry about the little preview for our last segment there. Leave a little link at GSMC.cloud. It is greatly appreciated. Huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and most importantly, the network as a whole. So do consider that. But without further ado, let's get into the show. Let's start off with hockey. Specifically, the Conn Smythe betting odds. As the series has kind of shifted in Florida's favor, we kind of see this volatility in the Conn Smythe betting odds, and it has been that way for kind of both finals, really, as certain teams have taken charge of the finals. We could be heading for sweeps in both, but right now, as Florida sits at a 2-0 lead, this Conn Smythe betting odds highly reflects that kind of factor. Let's start off with the number one player, and who else can it be except for the brick wall? I keep on saying he's a brick wall because he is, in my mind, Sergei Bobrovsky at minus 1,600. Then we go to Alexander Barkov. Don't think he's going to be staying in the second position for long due to his injury. We'll have to see how he plays through that at plus 500. Then McDavid drops from first to third at plus 500, and in fact is the only Edmonton Oiler still in the top 5 of the betting odds. Make of that what you will. Then we round out the top 5 with Matthew Tkachuk at plus 1,200 and Carter Verhaeghe at plus 2,200 to round out our top 5. So as you can see, like before, kind of a very Florida-centric top 5, but McDavid was at the top of the list, mainly due to the fact that he was the best player in this final. But still, you can see guys like Leon Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard slowly dropping down. I still think McDavid being in the top 3 is a little ambitious and puts a lot of pressure on McDavid to deliver as the series shifts back to home in Edmonton. But I do think that the top 2, we can get rid of Barkov, so the top 1 really is well-deserved for Sergei Bobrovsky. Think about this. We have seen so many good goaltending runs in these past couple of playoffs. We've seen guys like Jordan Binnington in his rookie season when the Blues won. We've seen guys like Jake Ottinger also in his rookie season have a huge breakout. These different runs, Carey Price when he was a little bit older, Braden Holtby as well. So we've seen so many good goaltending runs to get to the point in the playoffs. But this one just feels a bit different, mainly due to the fact that the Florida Panthers don't necessarily feel like they have to rely on Sergei Bobrovsky. He is just elevating his game above and beyond what people expect of a high-end goaltender. Whereas guys like Binnington and Jake Ottinger kind of stepped into these teams that weren't necessarily as well-rounded as this Florida Panthers team is right now at the current moment, and elevated their game to kind of really help this team. Without them, maybe their respective teams would not have made it to this point. But it's different with Sergei Bobrovsky. 14-5 record, over 910 save percentage, under 180 goals against average in this playoffs. So you can see the fact that Sergei Bobrovsky feels like it's well deserved. We don't necessarily say that about so many goalies in this era of the NHL, where so many defensemen and centers kind of step up in the playoffs. The past couple of Conn Smythe trophies have gone to high-level defensemen. That's as far as they will go to giving more defensive-minded players a trophy in the playoffs. But right now, it just feels right to see Sergei Bobrovsky sitting at the top of the rankings. 2 fantastic games to start off the finals. I think that he will need to continue that because more pressure will be on him as the series shifts to Edmonton. It is one of the best atmospheres in all of hockey. The place will be rocking for their Oilers to come back. And a lot of pressure will be on this Florida Panthers team, especially now that Barkov, his status is up in the air. Obviously, I don't necessarily think the Florida Panthers are just around Barkov, but he is a huge part of that team. I still think Florida needs to keep their mindset in the right place. I think that in this series, obviously one of the furthest distances between Stanley Cup finals, so maybe that kind of mindset sets in as Florida makes the long journey to Edmonton of cockiness settling in. So I do kind of expect maybe in the next couple of days for these Conn Smythe rankings to change again. But as it stands right now, Sergei Bobrovsky definitely looks like the most well-deserving player in that position. Now, as for the Edmonton Oilers side of things, Connor McDavid being third is kind of the right place for him in my mind. Because he's kind of always going to be lurking there, especially as the series shifts back to Edmonton. I don't think Connor McDavid has any pressure on him at the moment. I know it's kind of weird to say, but I think he can rely on this Edmonton team to kind of bolster themselves around him. And so I really, truly believe that Connor McDavid is one of those guys who, when all is said and done, can even this series and really regain status in this Conn Smythe Trophy betting odds, especially when the Panthers' best offensive-minded player is injured as well, and his status is up in the air. So, do I expect other Edmonton players to rise? Should they steal 1 or 2 games at home? Not necessarily. I think that Connor McDavid has to be the catalyst of that. Obviously, I think Leon Draisaitl and Evan Bouchard can elevate their games because they've been doing it for the entirety of the postseason. But when all is said and done, Connor McDavid is the face of the team. He is the brand of this team. And coming back home to Edmonton, I really think that Edmonton will be the more focused of the two. Their focal points will be focused on a lot more. They're a little bit more upbeat. I think at even strength, they know they need to improve, and so they'll focus on that. And I wouldn't be surprised if Connor McDavid ascends to at least the number 2 spot. Now, looking at the other guys in the top 5, in Matthew Tkachuk and Carter Verhaeghe, they have been really kind of quiet, in my opinion, in this Stanley Cup Finals. They have had decent postseasons, both of them. So, Matthew Tkachuk and Carter Verhaeghe, I'm not necessarily mad to see them in this top 5, but they definitely need to keep performing in this Stanley Cup Finals because right now their goaltender is just sitting pretty up there. And it just feels like, in terms of the series as a whole, Florida just has a lot of house money in every area of this series. They own the 2-0 lead. They own the better goaltender. They own all the problems that Edmonton is trying to solve right now. Their penalty kill has been fantastic. Their power play, while they haven't had many, has been stellar. It just goes to show that maybe that mindset might be what comes back to bite them. Is the only hope that Edmonton may have in this series, in this Conn Smythe betting odds. Because Connor McDavid, he's lucky to be sitting third. I think guys like Evan Rodriguez have especially stepped up. I think he's a dark horse in terms of betting odds. Should he continue his fine form in the Stanley Cup Finals, he needs to make up a lot of ground because there have been a lot of good Florida Panthers performances by other players in previous postseason rounds. But Connor McDavid just feels like he's lurking in the background. He is the kind of monster waiting to come out of the ashes and rise again like the phoenix. And so I feel like these Conn Smythe betting odds, you really are hard pressed to find a terrible option. but you also are very hard-pressed to find a safe option. I do think Sergei Bobrovsky well deserves to be in this list. He has had a stellar postseason, nothing short of fantastic in between the creases for Florida, but it just feels like there is that opportunity, that sense of mystery, that sense of aura surrounding this Edmonton Oilers team right now. And the distance between these two teams geographically could certainly come into play. I know it sounds weird to say that geography matters in a series of this nature and in like specifically a betting odds list, but I do think it does. I think that Edmonton will want to come out for their hometown crowd and really make a statement. They don't want to go out without a bang. Connor McDavid certainly doesn't want to. I think it would really make this Conn Smythe betting odds even more intriguing and versatile than it already has been. But as it stands, I'm really comfortable with how these standings are looking. I'm not necessarily angered, mad, or surprised at who is on this list because it speaks for itself as to how Florida has really taken over this series. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up next, weird, wacky, fun, whatever you want to describe it, a Game 3 between the Boston Celtics and Dallas Mavericks happened last night in the NBA Finals, and I will be here to cover all the fantasy implications and fantasy fallout from that game. You don't want to miss that segment. We will be right back to talk more about basketball.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows with 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you liked that little update on the Conn Smythe betting odds, but as always in this hyped NBA Finals and Stanley Cup Finals atmosphere, we always transition in our first two segments from hockey and basketball and hockey. We keep on bouncing back and forth. I promise next week, should the Celtics sweep and the Panthers kind of take control of this series, it'll be tamped down and we can get more into the nitty-gritty of other sports. But this is how it will stay for the last couple of days here. So we switch from the NHL to the NBA, where, let's just say, a game happened last night in the NBA Finals between the Boston Celtics and the Dallas Mavericks. Ultimately, the Boston Celtics taking complete and utter control of this series, in my humble opinion, with a 106-99 victory. Let's just go over the fantasy stats before I go into the implications of this game as well. Luka Doncic obviously had a very good fantasy game, 42.4 points, very respectable for him. 27, 6, and 6 in terms of his stat line. But the big surprise of the Dallas Mavericks, Kyrie Irving, finally showed up. I know it was to no avail, they didn't win the game, but Kyrie Irving, as we know him and love him, kind of showed up. He had 39.6 fantasy points, 35, 3, and 2 stat line. Really helped Dallas to kind of dominate most of the large portions of this game. But let's switch over to the Celtics. Jason Tatum also stepping up in terms of scoring output. So, haters, if you're there, does this prove you guys wrong? We'll see. 45.7 fantasy points, 31, 6, and 5 stat line. And obviously, Jaylen Brown, the leading fantasy scorer, surprised there after Luka has taken the fantasy world by storm in this finals. 50.6 fantasy points for Jaylen Brown, 38-8 stat line. Now, in terms of fantasy fallout implications surrounding this game, I'm going to say something weird in those terms. This certainly does not feel like it was the best barometer for how this series has gone fantasy-wise. Mainly for two reasons. One, there was a Kristaps Porzingis-sized hole in the Celtics lineup that they kind of had to figure out. And B, Luka fouling out really could have been the difference between him having 40 fantasy points and maybe 50-55 fantasy points. Let's start, although, with the Kristaps Porzingis-sized hole in the roster. There's a lot of questions surrounding that. If Kristaps Porzingis was in the lineup, do Jason Tatum and Jaylen Brown elevate their level of scoring? Does that subtract from the high level of fantasy output that both of them had? That certainly can be an interesting question, but at this moment in time, we'll never know. The fact of the matter is they just stepped up when it mattered, and so it is right now. In terms of Luka's foul out, I think that in the grand scheme of things, yes, it's unprofessional, but still it's Luka. It's Luka Doncic. He's always going to be one of the better fantasy basketball players. I certainly think he was detrimental to the whole Dallas organization last night. He let his teammates down in clutch time by doing that. But frustration for a player of that caliber can definitely set in when, things aren't going your way and you just have to suck it up and accept it for what it is. I just think that Luka will have a bounce back game. It will tell us a lot about his character, not only as a real life player, but as a fantasy player, because I know he has it in him. We have seen it countless times in both the regular season and postseason. Luka Doncic is never truly down. But from the Celtics side of things, only two major things surprised me about this Celtics performance. One, the fact that they were able to weather both storms, being down 13 early in the first and then up 21 early in the second and kind of early into the fourth. And then weathering that Mavericks run where they closed the lead to 1 point and then ultimately pulling away and winning, because in the past, Celtics teams in the past would have lost that game. It just goes to show that they've really built a certain character. They never say die. They never want to lose. They just have a relentless drive to the ultimate goal of hanging Banner 18 in the TD Garden rafters. But the bigger surprise to me is Joe Mazzulla. Joe Mazzulla's decision-making in the postseason has been nothing short of interesting, yet very vital to how the Boston Celtics have been able to handle any real adversity that has come their way. Obviously, Kristaps Porzingis has been out for large periods of time, and the question marks around the Celtics, and specifically Joe Mazzulla in particular, was how do you mitigate for that? How do you kind of revolve around the lack of big man depth and find an answer for teams that, play fast and teams that have superstars in the Mavericks, but you really have to be wary of. And I'm really shocked that Joe Mazzulla picked Xavier Tillman, but kudos to Xavier Tillman. I kind of want to go over his fantasy stats because he's never had such a prominent role in terms of fantasy as he did last night, but congratulations to him. 10.8 fantasy points, nice little utility option. 3, 4, and 2 blocks off the bench, a huge asset for them. And just goes to show Joe Mazzulla's willingness to stick to the status quo, never change for your opponent, saying to Xavier Tillman, look man, you're not necessarily the best player on this team, but you are on this team. You are a squad player. You play for the identity and sake of this team. Go out there and keep doing what Celtics basketball is. And Xavier Tillman did that to a T. Now, the whole question surrounding the reason why it was Xavier Tillman is a good one because, as we've seen in the past, Joe Mazzulla hasn't been really reliant on bench depth outside of guys like Al Horford. But when he has been, they have been in very critical situations. We saw in Game 3 of the Pacers series when Joe Mazzulla decided to use O'Shea Brissett in a heavy minutes rotation. And O'Shea Brissett was a huge help playing small ball center against a much faster-paced Indiana Pacers team. Now, Do I necessarily think that going forward, if Kristaps Porzingis isn't ready to go for Game 4, isn't fully fit, that he'll necessarily change? No. Joe Mazzulla is not known for changing. Joe Mazzulla is going to stick with what the Celtics organization, the Celtics identity is, and it just so happened that Xavier Tillman was the guy that Joe Mazzulla entrusted in that role. I think that guys like Luke Kornet, even Svi Mikhailiuk, O'Shea Brissett, Neemias Queta can also be a huge asset with his length and versatility. But Joe Mazzulla, there's something to be said about managing these lower level big men in the squad where all the question marks are surrounding them and saying, look guys, one of you is going to be the guy on each and every single night, on any given night, to step up into that role if need be. Look, we're down our best big men. Kristaps is out. Who is going to be the guy for me that I want to decide? And he has been masterful at that. He's been masterful at finding the weaknesses in other teams, and with or without Kristaps Porzingis, being able to decipher how he's going to use the limited depth, the only weakness, in my opinion, in Boston's squad, to elevate his team to their ultimate goal. So kudos to Joe Mazzulla. And let's switch back to the Mavericks. Obviously, I'm happy for Kyrie Irving that he had a better game. He broke the duck. He got out of his slump and really helped the Dallas Mavericks make this a game when they were down that big deficit early in the third and early in the fourth. And so I think that Kyrie Irving is my fantasy star of the game for just showing some moxie in a tough time. But ultimately, I think the big storyline here is the fact that Luka Doncic, the question remains whether or not, if but kind of thing revolving around his fouling out, his fallout in this game, really misrepresented how good he is. Because in that game setting, I really think it was a weird circumstance for Luka to kind of come out there frustrated, aggressive, and physical. Because look at what the Celtics have done to him, and look at what he's done to the Celtics. Luka Doncic on every single possession has been picked up almost immediately after the ball has been inbound. He has been pressured the full length of the court. And he still had been putting up huge fantasy points, over 60 points in both games. And this is the only night in the NBA Finals where he did not go over that 60-point threshold. So I'm really not that concerned about Luka Doncic. It was just one of those moments where a superstar up against a super team kind of had a meltdown that you have to expect at some point, because it always happens. It's inevitable. When you're a player in this league who really wants to do well, really wants to help his team, you kind of push. And sometimes that pushiness turns into aggression, and that aggression ultimately turns into foolish decisions. So, while I do think that Luka Doncic had a very unprofessional moment, it's kind of a moment he'll shake off, and he's going to be looking to get back into that mindset of aggression and physicality, but in a way that really helps his team as they go into Game 4. But that should just about do it for this segment of the show. I really enjoyed trying to break down this kind of confusing game, especially in terms of fantasy implications, because it was just so weird with all the question marks surrounding the absences of players and what happened in the latter stages of the game. Coming up next, an even more interesting segment. We kind of talked a little bit about fantasy football, but never about a certain player. Darren Waller announcing his retirement earlier this week, and how it changes the tight end fantasy landscape, both in the NFL as a whole and for the New York Giants. Ooh, that should be ugly. You don't want to miss this segment. It should be a great one. We'll be right back to discuss the fallout of that.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search...
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. To kind of alleviate the stress of the NBA Finals and the Stanley Cup and all that brings, the third segment, the midway point of the show, is a very interesting one. It could be a very weird discussion and debate about a certain player in fantasy football who kind of shocked the world with his decision last week and now has left us to kind of dissect the fallout and the debris he left behind. And that is Darren Waller. Darren Waller, over the past couple of years, especially when he was plying his trade with the Las Vegas Raiders, really became one of the top fantasy tight ends, a kind of cult hero figure for tight ends that really bolstered the position group as a whole. Obviously, you have your top end guys like Travis Kelce, but Darren Waller was just a really interesting figure due to his unexpected rise with the Las Vegas Raiders, this weird trade to the New York Giants to help bolster their skill position groups, and now the shocking retirement that he announced early this week. Whether or not you believe it was for the zodiac sign reason, or whether or not it was just he didn't necessarily like how the Giants set up, he was just frustrated, it really did send a little bit of shockwaves. Not necessarily in the NFL landscape because of the fact the Giants are a team that a lot of people might not want to play for at this time. Sorry, Giants fans. But more so in the fantasy tight end landscape because Darren Waller, obviously he's fallen off. But can you say it was entirely his fault? He did not have good quarterback play. He had Tommy DeVito throwing him the football. Tommy Cutlets, although a cult figure, is not the best quarterback to be throwing you the football, and so it's up to our interpretation as to why Darren Waller retired like he did. But let's just talk about Darren Waller as a player. Obviously, starting off his career with the Las Vegas Raiders, that was really where he made his name for himself. Back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons really gained the attention of so many different fantasy managers because they've been looking for a tight end, kind of not necessarily in the top end of the market, like a Travis Kelce, or now Sam Laporta, or, any, like George Kittle, So Darren Waller breaking out early on in the 2020s really made a huge impact and groundswell in this whole fantasy landscape. Darren Waller was just an appealing figure. He played for a Las Vegas Raiders team that, when you look at them with that offense, with Derek Carr, bringing in breaking receivers like Hunter Renfrow and Darren Waller back then, it was really just an interesting level of production where the Las Vegas Raiders were never one of the better offenses in the league, but Darren Waller was a huge reason as to why they sometimes put up huge stats. And so, let's just go over some of those stats. In back-to-back years, in 2019 and 2020, when he really broke out, he had over 1,000 yards. He played in the Pro Bowl both those years. He really elevated his status, especially in fantasy. Top 10 tight end in average live drafts in the early stages of his career. But then, he makes this weird transition to the Giants, whether it be because Derek Carr left and he didn't necessarily want to play with a lower level QB, or something about that. He gets traded to the Giants, and he regresses to the mean. He declines steadily. In the past couple of years, only 1 touchdown, 4 receptions per game, 10 yards per catch last year. So by no means was he producing at the level people knew he could. And so that kind of frustration might have seeped in and could be a greater reason than, say, his zodiac sign for him kind of retiring this early in his career. Now, what it does for the fantasy landscape, honestly, since his career was kind of falling off at this point in time, maybe it doesn't make as many shockwaves in the fantasy tight end landscape as I choose to believe, but he was still ranked in the top 20 tight ends coming into the season. Obviously, looking at the outlook of the Giants' offense, he could have been expected to be one of their go-to targets as Daniel Jones tries to break in more receivers. Obviously, him coming back injured could have been a huge part of why he was ranked a little bit lower as well, because a guy, especially like Daniel Jones coming back from injury, could have a lot of roller coaster moments as the season goes on. And so that was probably the main reason why he chose to leave and hang up his boots. But just looking at the Giants landscape, you now have a tight end room that really does not have any strong suits in it. Obviously, you have a guy in Daniel Bellinger who could break out, the 2022 lower-round draft pick, mid-round draft pick for them. He had 25 receptions last year for 255 yards. Not terrible considering the Giants' QB situation, but still, it's not necessarily the level of production you would want out of a tight end. And then behind him, you have a rookie out of Penn State, Theo Johnson, who hasn't played a snap of NFL football. So that's also a huge concern. And then looking at Daniel Jones' return, the huge question there is, would Daniel Jones have really elevated Darren Waller? And the answer, in my opinion, is I can't really say that for sure. Right now, he certainly does have a very appealing skill position group now that they've added an explosive, very vertical route runner in terms of his speed and explosiveness off the outside and Malik Neighbors. But he certainly doesn't necessarily have a skill position group that I'm thrilled about. And Darren Waller certainly could have helped there. In terms of fantasy production, I don't necessarily know what Darren Waller's expected projections for the season were. They obviously would have been a little bit less than past years, but maybe I'm overthinking this a little bit. Maybe this whole segment is coming back and trying to help Daniel Jones and how their partnership kind of developed had he not retired, and they could have had a fantastic season together. And the Giants transition from, an offense that had so many different questions in that skill position group to one that maybe had several questions but not as many in the past. I just think that the situation, make of it what you will. That's what I'll say. Make of it what you will. But Darren Waller, I don't necessarily think fantasy managers will be that mad about him leaving. I think that him being in a Giant system that didn't really fit him, I just think that, there comes a time in your career when you have to make a decision based on the fact that you might be frustrated with how things are going. And fate of circumstance here for Darren Waller was that with Las Vegas, he had a breakout couple of seasons, and the hype surrounding him was as high as it was ever going to be. And then he moved to a team that didn't necessarily fit him. That's all I can really say about the situation. He's going to be a mystery for many years, a very enigmatic retirement. I can't remember a retirement being this out of the blue or bizarre in my lifetime, in any sport really, because of the fact that maybe Andrew Luck could be a comparable kind of player to delve into considering Darren Waller's early retirement. Andrew Luck obviously expected to have the number one fantasy quarterback. He was going very high for a quarterback on a lot of boards, and then out of the blue he retired. But with Andrew Luck, I could definitely see it more than I could see it with Darren Waller, because even though Darren Waller might have been frustrated with the offense, Andrew Luck was someone who was just really he had a terrible career in terms of injuries, and that was why he hung up the boots early. He didn't necessarily want to do any more damage to his body than he already did. And so with Darren Waller, I mean, come on, man, you have to kind of stick with it, you know what I mean? Obviously, I know it probably was tough that season where you didn't meet expectations, you didn't exceed expectations even. So, but you have to give it a chance, The season beforehand, Brian Dable was actually creating something with Daniel Jones, and Daniel Jones was serviceable. So who knows, had Daniel Jones, obviously, before his injury, he kind of was regressing horribly, but you kind of have to stick with it if you're a tight end. That's my opinion, because the tight end position is just a position where you really have to be a guy who's willing to do the dirty work. And Darren Waller, for many years, did it better than anyone in the NFL, in my opinion. He's just a serviceable guy who always seemed to benefit the team no matter how many receiving yards he had, no matter what he did with the team. He was just a very beneficial part of their offense. Obviously, he definitely had his fair share of injuries and controversy surrounding him, but ultimately, this whole retirement thing is just befuddling. And I don't even know why I'm presenting it as a segment to you guys. I just thought it would be interesting to examine that. But that'll just about do it for this segment. We're going to be switching from kind of this very weird, wacky world of fantasy football to the fantasy realm that I'm really continuously excited to present to you guys. We're going to be previewing not one but two teams for the Euros. The current European heavyweights, Le Bleu, the Frenchman, and then the host, who are trying to retain that level of dominance they had earlier on in this 2-decade span in Germany. We don't want to miss that, do we? It'll be coming up right after these breaks.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows, available everywhere.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are down to our last two segments of the day and they should be very exciting ones. We are going to continue our Euros fantasy team previews where I present to you different teams who are going to be contenders in this tournament and the breakout fantasy players, the established veteran fantasy players who I think you should integrate into your roster if you are still confused about that. We are going to start off with a France squad that has been one of the best in Europe over the past couple of years. World Cup runners-up in 2022, World Cup champions in 2018, Euros finalists in 2016, so they have been there and done that for these past couple of years in major tournaments, so they are no stranger to being prepared to fight in these major tournaments, especially in the Euros, a tournament they haven't won in quite some time. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, as we all know, France are known as being a team that has so many versatile players from top to bottom that can play in many different positions. So if you're looking to have a hybrid level player at any given position, look to France to help you out in that regard. It might cost you a pretty penny due to the talent in the squad, but it is going to be mightily worth it. Now, let's start about the prettiest penny of all, the crown jewel of this golden generation of French football, the man at the top of the pyramid for France, Kylian Mbappe. Kylian Mbappe is going to set you back a huge amount of money, but deservedly so. One of the best players in the world. He is always going to be in the conversation in Euros for the Golden Boot and in the world of Ballon d'Or. He is one of the favorites to win the Golden Boot. I think that he will be a huge penalty taker. He's going to benefit from all these different hybrid players delivering him the ball in the box. So look for Kylian Mbappe to have one of the highest scoring outputs for any striker at this Euros. It all starts and ends with Kylian Mbappe in the attack. Another more wily, creative player and more flair-centric player that you can incorporate into your squad, who I really love as a fantasy option, is Antoine Griezmann. Antoine Griezmann will cost you 9 million euros, very expensive, but as an international player, he just is different gravy. He has a different mentality. He fits so well into this France squad that has such depth in every position and experience, and he's just that creative engine that can cut inside, drop centrally, really create havoc for opposing midfields to figure out. And I think in this tournament he's going to be better than ever. I think that Antoine Griezmann, a lot of people are underestimating him a little bit in this tournament as he ages out of this, not necessarily out of this squad, but as he progresses in age. as he's one of the older players in this French squad, I still think he has a couple tournaments in him where he proved that he is one of the best international players right now. Now let's transition to the other two strikers, the more well-known, established strikers that you would call striker positions. Obviously, Kylian Mbappe, I wouldn't necessarily call an out-and-out striker. He is their number 9, quote-unquote. But the two guys that I'm really excited about in terms of French strikers is obviously Olivier Giroud, has one of the most prolific French careers in terms of goal scoring, the top goal scorer internationally. He's still doing it at a high level. I don't necessarily think he'll score as many goals now that Kylian Mbappe is seen as their main striker, their main focal point in the attack. But Olivier Giroud is still a player who can bang in some goals for you and your Euros fantasy squad. And off the bench, Randall Kolo Muani, a very interesting option. Obviously, we might be singing a different tune about France as a dynasty had he put that goal past Emiliano Martinez in the World Cup final in 22. But Randall Kolo Muani, domestically, has been one of the better players, a very intriguing player, a lot of skill, pace, electricity he can add to that French attack. Very dangerous player. At $8 million for your budget, he is kind of expensive for a alternative option for France at the striker position, but I think he can be a very intriguing player, especially in the knockout rounds, as you want to use more players for your squad. Now, kind of moving back a little bit to the midfield, where the French have some of the best players in those positions in the entire world, in my honest opinion. Because of the fact that not only can they play in the midfield, they can play at wing back, center back even. We've seen them do it countless times before. It is that dynamic duo. Obviously, Aurélien Tchouameni is doubtful for this tournament, but I think he might be able to play in latter rounds. We'll have to see with him. But Eduardo Camavinga is the player to watch for this French midfield because he can invert, he can be a wing back, he can drive up the pitch. He's just so versatile. He's a wild card, in my opinion, a sleeper pick to fit either in your midfield or your defense if you want a guy who gets a lot of ball recoveries, whips in a lot of crosses, maybe takes a couple corners. He's just so integral to how France plays. He is just a mysterious, enigmatic player sitting in the base of their midfield or out wide. So look for Eduardo Camavinga to have a fantastic tournament. Obviously not a goal scorer, but if you want a guy who can get ball recoveries, interceptions, whip a cross in for assists, takes corners, he might be your man. And let's go all the way back to defense, where if you want a good wing-back for your team, Theo Hernandez is as good as any. One of the best attacking left-backs in world football. Just such a versatile player. Obviously, his brother Luca Hernandez is hurt, so Theo's role is going to be much more monumental in this tournament. All these different world-class clubs in the world have a lot of interest in him, including Bayern Munich. So Theo Hernandez is going to want to show up and show out at this Euros. Look for him to whip in a lot of crosses. Look for him to advance further up the pitch than maybe he has done in prior tournaments. So Theo Hernandez, I think he can be a no-brainer in your backline for your Euro squad. In terms of dark horses for this tournament, how about Mike Maignan? Obviously, transitioning from a guy in Hugo Lloris, who was one of the best international goalkeepers of all time, obviously not domestically, but Mike Maignan certainly can do a job in goal for France. I think he will be in the conversation to win Golden Glove, as France will make it very far in this tournament. So look out for Mike Maignan in goal to really help the squad. Obviously, Aurélien Tchouameni, if he's healthy and is fit and can play in latter stages of the tournament, look for Aurélien Tchouameni to be a guy who you might want to slot into your midfield. He is fantastic at long-range goals. He is fantastic in ball recoveries. Him and Eduardo Camavinga, should they ever partner up in this tournament, we'll have to see with his health. They will be one of the most dangerous midfield or even out wide duos in this tournament. Now, also in terms of young players, I really do think that Warren Zaire-Emery could get a couple minutes. talented 18-year-old out of PSG's academy who had a fantastic season, did very well in the latter stages of the Champions League for them, scored a couple goals there, so we can see the obvious talent he might bring to the French attack, different player to focus on and befuddle opposing defenses. And then a guy in Bradley Barcola, also of PSG, making that move from Lyon to PSG, who is also very versatile, can play in any position along the front line, and he's just so dynamic. He is not necessarily known for scoring many goals, didn't necessarily have that much playing time at PSG this year, but Bradley Barcola could be one of the cheaper players for your fantasy squad if you're willing to take a risk. Leave him on your bench and maybe bring him in as an impact sub there. But let's just face it, guys. France, much like England, who I previewed yesterday, are going to be one of the teams to watch, both in this tournament and in terms of your fantasy squad, because of the fact they just have so many players. If you're looking for that hybrid role yet again, I can't remind you enough of how versatile so many France players are. That's what people love about this team. That no matter what, any player at any given time can play in any role, maybe except for Kylian. I would love to see Kylian Mbappe at left back, actually. That would be kind of fun to watch. But still, all around the pitch, France is one of the most talented teams in this tournament. Most talented players in the world. People often say their B team would be strong enough to play and win major tournaments, and I honestly believe them because of how well this team is structured. Kudos to Didier Deschamps for getting the best out of these players on an international stage, really helping them transition from a domestic mindset to an international mindset. We don't give enough credit to these coaches who really help level up these players, especially guys like Antoine Griezmann, who have struggled domestically in their careers, but on the international stage shine so bright. And so I was just so glad to be able to present such a well-rounded, talented team. Look for them in your Euro fantasy squads because of the fact they're so good. They're one of my picks to win the tournament, if not to win it all outright. But that should just about do it for this Euros team fantasy preview of France. Coming up next, we transition to the host nation, Germany, Die Mannschaft, a team looking to get back to their level of dominance we saw almost 2 decades ago. We'll be right back with that segment. Should be a good one to close out today's show. Hello everyone, and welcome back to the last segment of today's show, the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. It should be a good one, but before I forget, I do want to remind you guys that if you do feel so inclined to leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud, a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network. Sorry I forgot about it earlier in the show, but just want to remind you yet again. Now, to close out the show, we have another fantastic preview of a team in the Euros. The host nation, a German team looking to get back to that level we saw at the 2014 World Cup. Now, I'm telling you guys, this right now, this team is one to beware of because they definitely have the players to go very far in this tournament. They definitely have the players you might want in your Euros fantasy squad. It's just a matter of their identity. If they can get it all together, they can definitely have the nous to go as far as the finals and maybe even win it. The first host nation to win it since France actually did in 1984. So without further ado, let's go in and preview Germany in terms of their fantasy implications. Now, Germany is definitely one of the most talented teams on paper. Whether or not it translates onto the actual pitch is the major question here. But looking at their fantasy stats and their budgets, I think that Germany is a very appealing team, especially in the group stages. They're in a group that shouldn't necessarily bother them that much. Obviously, it's very even between teams such as Scotland, Hungary, and Switzerland that kind of sit close to Germany in terms of Euro rankings. But I do think that Germany will succeed and potentially go very far in this tournament. Let's start off with one of the more controversial parts of this Germany team right now, their defense. There's just so many questions about who will lead this defensive line. Obviously, Antonio Rudiger is probably the first name in that defense that can slot in immediately. But I want to look at, in terms of fantasy, more sleeper picks, more guys who haven't necessarily gotten the respect they ultimately deserve. Let's start off with a guy who only made his Germany debut a couple of months ago in a left-back, Maximilian Mittelstadt, the 27-year-old left back out of VfB Stuttgart. And that just goes to show that right now, Germany have so many players. The problem with Germany was that maybe they were a bit too Bayern-centric, as Bayern has dominated domestic German football over the years. And so many Bayern players were integrated into that squad that maybe you just need that fresh juice from different German teams to come into the squad and really help it gain relevancy yet again, and Maximilian Mittelstadt will be a huge part of that. I'm keeping my eye on this guy. He's waited for such a long time to make his debut for Germany. Going to be one of the most versatile attacking left backs in Julian Nagelsmann's system. He wants to get the fullbacks up the pitch. Obviously, he has a fantastic cross to the football. His first ever goal for Germany was a cracker of a goal from outside the box in a friendly win over the Netherlands, who we'll preview tomorrow in terms of Euros. But still, Maximilian Mittelstadt right now is one of the more appealing left backs if you want to take a flyer on a guy, at least in the group stages, who can offer you that attacking from the defender positions. Maximilian Mittelstadt might be the guy. In terms of center back pairings, it's just a matter of who's going to slot in next to Antonio Rudiger, and the man to fill those shoes might be Jonathan Tah. He is a very inexpensive option, only $4.5 million. What I like about Jonathan Tah is that he has been criticized over the years for not being the fastest center back, but he's very, very physical, very, very good aerially. He's going to win a lot of headers, win a lot of balls. He's going to be vital in terms of interceptions for them, so he's not necessarily doing the pretty work. He's doing the dirty work back there for Germany. Look for him to partner very well with Antonio Rudiger, who certainly adds that level of pace to the Germany backline. So they're good counteracting and foils for each other in terms of that Germany backline. But of the two, Jonathan Tah might be the guy you want if you want a guy who's more known for his ball recoveries and not necessarily going forward, unlike Maximilian Mittelstadt. Now we get into the exciting portion. The midfield for Germany. One of the most talented midfields in world football. On paper, remember, on paper again, whether it all works together is the mystery. Julian Nagelsmann, obviously wanting to bring in a lot of talent in that midfield, has to kind of figure out what to do with it, because this is the most talented the German midfield has been in years. And so the question of who to specifically roster for your Euros fantasy squad is a tough one. But let's start out with one of the best players in the world right now in Florian Wirtz, the young 20-year-old. Obviously, it's been a long time coming for this dude. He feels so old, but he's still so young, mainly due to the fact that he was injured with an ACL tear, out for 2 seasons ago. Winning the Bundesliga in an unbeaten campaign with Bayer Leverkusen. Fantastic season. He's going to be a top 10 Ballon d'Or candidate, in my humble opinion. He's just so creative. He's seen scoring and contributing to 17 goals in the Bundesliga. Such a valuable player. It's going to have to be one of those guys who may have to take the back seat and let other guys around him kind of do their thing and pull the strings in the midfield, but look for Florian Wirtz to be very creative. I think he can have a lot of assists, if not goals. Had a fantastic long-range shot in a friendly against France a couple months ago. So look for Florian Wirtz to potentially be one of the golden boys, these golden young players in this tournament as the tournament progresses and should Germany go far. The guy next to him, a guy he wants to spend his entire career with in his humble opinion, Jamal Musiala, isn't bad either. This is a guy who has just been in so many Germany teams that really don't know what to do with him. He has been one of the most fun players to watch in world football, but sadly, I think the fact that Germany has never had a player quite like Jamal Musiala and his level of dribbling, because they never are really known for a dribbling player who can be as creative as Jamal Musiala. They're known for their more direct nature from their midfield, and so Jamal Musiala slotting into this midfield, creating something out of nothing and being one of the best players for Germany at these past couple of tournaments really speaks to the level of talent that Germany has and just has to figure out how to use. But Jamal Musiala, 8.5 million euros, look for him to partner with Florian Wirtz very well. They're just going to be so dynamic. I don't necessarily know how opposing defenses are going to play them. They're such a hard combination. But then you have an older guy in Toni Kroos who comes back into the squad, and his not necessarily creativity in terms of his dribbling skill. He's definitely not known for Toni Kroos. But just his vision and his footballing IQ really helps this Germany squad. Look for him to have a bucket load of assists from a deeper lying, more defensive midfield position. And him and Robert Andrich are going to be a very interesting duo, kind of at the baseline of Germany's midfield. To kind of ping the ball about, get these dynamic, more out wide midfield duos to get space and deliver balls into the box for a very, very debatable striker situation for Germany. You have a guy in Niklas Füllkrug who has proven himself over these past couple of years as one of the better striker options for Germany. Obviously, it's been a long time coming for him in terms of his international journey, being a guy who was playing in the Zwei Bundesliga and now being a Champions League finalist. What a career arc for Niklas Füllkrug, but he has just been a fantastic, whether as a starting striker or as an impact sub off the bench in other tournaments, can really be a spark plug for a German squad who might be lacking in terms of goal production in latter stages of the tournament. He can definitely step up. And then you have a guy in Kai Havertz who, while his talent has definitely been in luck as he has moved from Bayer Leverkusen to Chelsea to Arsenal, I just think that he needs a more stable mindset. I think that he can be very interesting this tournament as a false nine, as his movement on and off the ball can be very impactful for a Germany squad who definitely wants to have that confusing element to how they play. But I still think that the question is, do you want someone who's more of a goal-scoring threat, more known for their fantastic aerial ability, or do you want a guy who can definitely help in terms of movement? I think Kai Havertz is the better player defensively if you want a quote-unquote false nine striker option who can get you ball recoveries, is going to impact the squad defensively. But in terms of a pure goal-scoring threat, then Niklas Füllkrug is your man. Now, in terms of dark horses, I think that another striker for Germany, a much younger striker making his international squad debut, can be very interesting off the bench. Maximilian Bayer, I think, can definitely be a guy that a lot of people might look at, especially in the group stages, should he get a couple of minutes. But the German striker squad is such a difficult one to pan out. Now, in terms of this Germany squad, like I said before, they definitely have the players. They definitely have the potential you want in a Euros fantasy squad. They have the youth, they have the experience, they have the creativity, they have the player. The problem is, A, their mentality, and B, the fact that there really isn't a goal-scoring threat outside of Niklas Füllkrug in this squad. Can guys like Florian Wirtz and Jamal Musiala create something out of nothing? Obviously, we know they have some goals in them. Can guys like Maximilian Mittelstadt in their back line really help their attack from the fullbacking position? And can most importantly, a guy like Kai Havertz, should he be trusted to start with Julian Nagelsmann, really take off and help this Germany team kind of be a very hard team to play against due to their confusing nature of how these different players move? I think the pressure of how these teams perform, especially in terms of fantasy, is Julian Nagelsmann. Can he get this team right? Can he solve the pieces of the German puzzle and finally crack the code and get them out of the group stages and deep into the tournament? I think this can be one of the most exciting teams in the tournament in terms of their production. They can also be one of the most confusing and kind of really angering teams because of the fact they have so much talent and they might not produce. But that will just about do it for today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I really loved these past 2 segments that I shared with you guys. Please follow, like, and subscribe to the show. We are going to be back tomorrow with even more Euros action, more Stanley Cup and NBA action. Should be a fantastic show tomorrow. I've been Chris Shepard. Thank you guys yet again for tuning in. I can't wait to close out the week with you guys with another great show. This has been the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.